Boom! What's up, everyone? Welcome to Simulation. I'm your host, Alan Sakyan. Very excited to be talking about evolutionary anthropology, talking about the far future. We have Diego Caleiro joining us on the show. Hello.
All right. Hello, Al.
Thanks for coming on. Very excited, very grateful that we met at Jun Yoon's event last weekend.
That was a really great event.
Such a good event. I just have to shout out, this book's so good, Interdependent Capitalism, such a good book. Highly recommend everyone check it out. We just had Ari Nazem on the show last night.
Oh, really cool.
We also were hanging out with just another, young, 19-year-old Stanford, just super smart as well. It's just such a good community of people. Very grateful that we ended up meeting and having good conversation, and now we're here to talk. For those that don't know, we have some background on Diego. So Diego is a philosopher. He's an evolutionary anthropologist in training. You're doing so much, you're writing 3 papers right now. We're going to be breaking down this all in topics. Very excited. We'd like to start things off with this big history perspective on society. What is your current take on the state of humanity?
Right. So I guess my current take, it has 2 somewhat contradictory elements. On the one hand, it seems that poverty is as down as it's ever have been. Technology is rising. You can get pretty good picture of that in Hans Rosling book about the statistics of how the world has been unfolding in a very desirable way, let's say, in the last 100 and something years. I agree with all that. And on the other hand, it seems to me that we are not considering many possible avenues that could be inducing us closer to some sort of societal collapse or some sort of trouble. And I think one of the ways in which I'm slightly different from most of the thinkers and people who are around here in the Bay Area trying to reason about these things is that I lean on a more, let's make sure that even in these cases where that's what's actually going to unfold, that's what's actually going to manifest, we still create an awesome future later down the road. So that's been my perspective, I guess. So I think we're as good as we've ever been, but we're not necessarily on an upward trend. We might be on the very peak. So that's basically my take. Yeah.
Ooh, that's good. So it's important to see then that a trajectory may not, like you said, may be at a peak and then may be on an angle of declination potentially after that. So the moment in time, although it may look fantastic, we don't actually know which way it's going after. So
right.
Yes.
One thing that I wrote on a Facebook post a while ago was a big difference that I've observed in the reasoning and the cognition of people who are more left-leaning and more right-leaning among the people who are more intellectual, like both sides intellectuals, is that the left-leaning people tend to rely more on statistics and the projection and extrapolation of graphs, whereas the right-leaning people, they tend to be more focused on narratives and these invariance points, these points where there's a big shift. Let's say there's a graph that's moving up, something is getting up to 30%, but then at the 30% point, you expect something to differ dramatically. So I guess the most classical example is people discuss a lot about demographics. Is there consequential historical reasons to expect, if demographics change this much, what are going to be the consequences down the road? If different numbers of single mothers exist, for instance, or if the racial distribution of a group is different, if the cultural distribution is different. Usually, the more liberal people will be more interested in just extrapolating the curve and being excited about it because, it's worth being excited about. On the other hand, sometimes these things will change the narrative, and then the whole system kind of reorganizes itself.
This seems a little bit like what Peter Thiel was just discussing when he said that the Google narrative in Silicon Valley is that this is happening all the time, and that feels like, well, why haven't we solved cancer? Why are some of the intellectual communities stalling out in some of the ways? And so this is a very interesting conversation to have: is what is actually the trajectory, and how do we participate in making the trajectory beautiful?
Right. That's right. There's these 2 monsters, I think they're Lovecraftian monsters, that people use in order to make analogies for evolution and for problems in game theory, in the rationalist community, in the effective altruism community, and among Bay Area people, which are Azathoth, which should be a representative of the idea of evolution itself, and Moloch, which is a representation of all the things that, if each individual acts according to their self-interest, might end up going bad, right? So sometimes the system is organized in that way. The university system might be a system that has a problem in that way. So when the Brexit stuff happened, when Trump happened, I posted thinking about these two systems that so far the evolutionary forces had been curbed for a really long time, at least since the Industrial Revolution. And it was mostly like the problems that we were trying to solve with technology, the problems we were trying to solve with culture, were the problems of individual incentives and how to make things like faster and more functional between different people. So most of our problems were Moloch type. And I think that we've moved from these game theoretical problems back into a more survivalist state where, with Peter Thiel, with Tyler Cowen, who conceptualized things that way, I think we've eaten most of the low-hanging fruit. And now the forces that are going to be controlling a lot of what happens in the earth, like the big moving forces, are going to be more based off evolution and survival, and less about like game theory and the reorganization of incentives and things like that. So in that sense, if we've actually reached this peak of economic development and of how easy it is to acquire new technologies, then we might expect that there will be a little bit more of, we might end up electing someone who lived in a zero-sum market his entire career, such as Donald Trump, right? So that's a reflection, it seems to me, of becoming zero-sum, whereas we were positive-sum for a really long time.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so a main part of what we want to see, the growth, is the pie, this growing a positive sum over and over and over again. And that, like you indicated, this may have been a potentially a moment of zero-sum realization, and that changing culture in so many ways, and changing information technology and
if you think of even like the slogans that were running at the time, right? Like the idea of and not only in the previous election, right? In the previous election, there was the idea of America first. It assumes that, well, if we're not going to grow all together, then we might as well like let our side of the pie grow. And I guess now, if I've been watching a lot of the Yang Gang stuff, Andrew Yang's candidacy, and it's kind of the same idea, right? It's like, okay, so we want to have a redistributive policy because it's not clear that normal people, right? He wrote a book called The War of Normal People. Yeah, and it's not clear that there's going to be a way for growing the pie constantly in all of its parts. Therefore, should we distribute it? Maybe, So I think that it's important to consider this possibility that the technological trend is on a peak and maybe going down.
And then is it potential also that then the ones that are already in maybe the top of the SES, socioeconomic status, that own a lot of the production already, that are owning a lot of the robotics manufacturing already, drone manufacturing already, artificial intelligence, algorithmic drive of things like the social media networks that we use and everything, that maybe that the production, the rewards of the production for them is just going to be significantly greater than for the normal people, that's what we see with the GDP increasing while median male income stagnates. And so that's a major issue is the stagnation or even declination for normal people. And that causes instability in a civilization, and that's bad news.
Yeah, there's an evolutionary anthropologist who studied that. He wrote a book about basically how inequality, especially inequality among men, it tends to be a strong driver of violence and a strong driver. I think it's called killing the competition. It's basically a driver for young male violence and for young male, in general, like instability. There's ways of trying to solve this instability. People have tried video games. Some people take on drugs. It's unclear where we should, steer.
Meaning is a very important vaccination, delivering the proper nutrients to every seed when they're birthed into the world, having a strong social fabric, etc. Okay,
Right.
Tell us about, we're going to touch on this as we keep going, but tell us about, growing up in Brazil and getting fascinated with evolutionary anthropology. How did this all get started?
Right. Well, growing up in Brazil, I was born in São Paulo, and it's a very big city, so it's a cosmopolitan city. I was always fascinated ever since I had my first class on survival of the fittest about evolution. And there's been basically two topics that fascinated me my entire life, which are, in any given topic that you tell me, I'm usually going to get closer within that topic to like evolution in some way. So what evolves that is related to the thing you're talking about, or about minds. So, evolutionary anthropology and evolutionary psychology, which are very related fields, they're basically the union of these two main attractors, right? My main intellectual attractors my whole life have been to understand better what the mind is, how the mind works, where does it come from, and to understand evolutionary systems and in which ways do they develop, in which ways should we expect them to unfold over time. So I stayed in Brazil for a long time. I did philosophy for the most part because the smartest professors in my university turned out to be the people in philosophy. I started doing psychology and then I transferred because I wanted to be, wherever the intellectual edge was, and in my university it was in the philosophy department. I ended up writing a book about the philosopher Dennett, who is an evolutionary thinker and a philosopher of mind. So he likes the same stuff I do, basically. And and I ended up kind of thinking that philosophy is going to run a little bit stagnant in the next few decades, in philosophy of mind in particular, and it wasn't going to solve some of the questions that I still had. It had already solved a lot of the questions I had before. Therefore, I felt like trying something new, and I found Professor Terrence Deacon, who's my advisor, and he studies evolutionary anthropology and neuroscience, and he had a very different perspective, but still involving, minds and evolution, these two topics that I really appreciate.
So a lot of this started with you having an appreciation for seeing survival of the fittest and seeing not only like Darwinian evolution kind of as part of humanity, but also just an obsession with how the mind is molded through this process as well, how it evolves through culture, how it gets influenced, and then kind of melding the evolutionary anthropology with psychology.
Right. I guess in part, that's because I'm an intuitive immortalist, so I've always wanted to live as long as possible, and I guess the idea of survival of the fittest is fairly connected. And my interest in philosophy of mind, my interest in understanding how mind works, and the associated areas was basically stemming in part from, okay, so it seems that I am this kind of system. Is there a way to preserve this system over time in a way that would be robust and valuable? But Woody Allen has a good quote on that, which is, I don't want to be immortal through my work. I want to be immortal through not dying. And a lot of me wanted to, figure out through evolution, through philosophy of mind, in which ways is it possible to stabilize minds over time. Most of that quest, I think I've let go of. But I'm still interested in stabilizing values and stabilizing like ethical systems and values over the very long run. And I would say that that's basically the thing that compels me and has compelled me for the past few years in my work.
Stabilizing ethical systems and values.
Making sure that whatever happens in the future, is still something that we would consider very valuable,
yes.
or even that, we can't even anticipate, but that it's still, desirable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting. So then it's as though the keeping the ethics, the values that has made civilization great, keeping that code, making sure that it continues moving forward and becoming better, so that way we ensure that positive, that future.
Right, and especially because at least, I'm in part a utilitarian, right? I like to tell people that everyone has a part that they're selfish and a part that they're altruistic.
Yeah.
The part of me that is altruistic is a utilitarian, right? And wants to maximize the amount of good that happens in the entire course of history. So a lot of my thoughts go in that direction. and that basically means that requires for civilization to go on, for the possibility of its expansion into space, for the creation of minds that will align in their interests and interconnect in amazing, transformative different ways that we have hitherto not seen, you know.
Get to the edge of knowledge, explore what goes past our edge of knowledge, make new, great protocols that maximize the flourishing of new minds. Yeah.
Right.
So then, you know, from there, then how did you get brought into the Berkeley ecosystem? Yeah. Tell us about that.
So the transitioning factor was I was already interested in utilitarianism, and basically I wanted to figure out, you know, after my main quest stopped being trying to seek for personal immortality, it became let's figure out, you know, how to make the world the best possible world for the maximum amount of minds over the largest course of time. And there were other people in the world who were interested in the same thing, who were also young and kind of excited and connecting themselves through the internet. And those people ended up becoming what later was the effective altruism movement, right? So this was before it had a name, but I connected with some of those people, and I created the first transhumanist and effective altruism related institution in Brazil. And I directed it for a while. It's still ongoing. There's still, you know, a few people there. For a little while, we had like 25 people
Nice.
organizing a think tank, promoting things. I was, you know, interviewed, went to magazines, and a bunch of other things. So that was my entering on this world that later became effective altruism through my utilitarianism, and the two main hubs in the world for that were Oxford and Berkeley. And I decided, because I'm Brazilian and Oxford is really cold and I would have a hard time there, and I also have a hippie side of me and I like dancing, that I would be much better off by trying to come to Berkeley than Oxford. That's basically why I applied to Berkeley.
Okay, and then now since you've been at Berkeley, and what has been, you know, you were teaching me about this, and you were teaching us about this earlier, you know, you see all of the potential of where civilization can go, and you see that there is a potential for this, you know, this non-superintelligence future. And so even though the superintelligence future looks like it's quite likely that we're going in that direction, what if it's actually several hundred years later than what we're predicting? So how can we ensure that the civilization, the values and the ethics
of that civilization, of that civilization go forth? So I think the reason why a lot of people are driven, especially Bay Area tech people, are driven to the idea of a singularity, the idea of superintelligence, is it's, on the one hand, it's very exciting, and on the other hand, it kind of relieves one from some obligations that we used to have with evolution, right? So more conservative people feel like they have more familial obligations, they feel like they have obligations to their nation, a bunch of things that they were born already having. More adventurous, left-leaning, innovative people will want there to be a new potential technology that releases them from all these tangential discomforts, let's say. So let me draw one parallel here, and then I'll go back to that. I think one interesting person who did an experiment in thinking about how the future is going to be without making this assumption of like, okay, there will be a superintelligence and it will generate very valuable things, was Robin Hanson when he wrote The Age of M. And the idea there is, okay, let's limit things at about human intelligence, but let's change actually the way in which this intelligence reproduces. So the main thing that he created was, okay, if we can actually reproduce labor fairly quickly by creating virtual brains that you can literally replicate by copying a program, how would the economy be transformed and how would society be transformed? I think this is an extremely valuable exercise because this is one possible avenue of the future, right? So I love the Bostrom type exercise where you extrapolate superintelligence. I love the Robin Hanson exercise where you extrapolate what happens if replication gets cheaper and we still have our level of intelligence. But I thought to myself, okay, who is actually doing the exercise of what if neither of those two transformative technologies comes to fruition? We still want to create the awesome future for as many people as possible. So let's take how evolution has been unfolding so far, biologically and culturally, and how it has led us to the point where we are now, and then extrapolate in which direction evolution seems to be going, and see to what extent we can steer that movement in a desirable direction. And that's where evolutionary anthropology comes in, because it's the study of populations, societies, and cultures, and the ways in which they've interacted, in which they had more or fewer children, went to war, didn't go to war, built a wall, didn't build a wall, made open borders, all sorts of transformations, which so far have guided the course of history. And like maybe someone should be thinking about how to do that, like how would the world look like and what to do if the next 2,000 years are kind of like the last 2,000 years, And there's very few utilitarians, there are very few Bay Area people excited about that. So
that's a good point. Yeah. Because we definitely have a strong proclivity to feel like we're at the super intelligence is just 50 or 100 years. Like these are our numbers. It's happening this generation and everything, and it's just like it's kind of being driven forth by Silicon Valley in many ways, this narrative, but at the same time the narrative of how do we ensure that if civilization is like it's been the last 1,000 years for the next 1,000 years, how do we have a stable growth of our ethics and morals? This is very, very important to discuss.
Right. One thing that it just seems to be lacking, in these big urban centers that aggregated some of the smartest people in the world, is basically like no one is thinking of, hey, what if the method by which we create new intelligences in the future continues to be via sex and babies?
Yeah.
Like no one is thinking about that. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, no one who's more utilitarian.
Yeah.
Right?
And
there's loads of religious people thinking about it, but
that family, sex, babies, keeping this, family ties, community ties, really, really strong and powerful is something that I'm excited for you to touch on a little bit later in our conversation. What is, I read your post about the Christianity superorganism, and you had a video about
right.
it. Yeah, so teach us about this. 2 billion people around the world are Christian?
There's around 2 billion people who are Christian. Yeah, about the same number, like the Muslims passed the Christians not that long ago. So when I started examining what's going on from this evolutionary perspective with no transformational technologies, I guess the first thing you wonder is, okay, who is growing as a fraction of the population and who is diminishing as a fraction of the population? And interestingly enough, religion aside, right, if you just look at the different nations, there's been a very interesting transformation where the people who would eventually migrate to the cities where most of the information transfer is happening between intelligent people, let's say in the USA or in London or in a few other centers in Europe, at least in the USA, they used to be coming from the Bible Belt, right? They're usually the people who were born in a religious source. They often were people who deconverted or went for a job in the coasts. Yeah. And then, they become the source of the new Facebook, of the new interesting technology transformational thing. But this sort of stops happening because there's been a very, very strong decline in number of childbirth women in the vast majority of Western societies. So what's happening now is the equatorial societies, the Indonesians, Nigeria, and many other sub-Saharan African countries, and maybe some parts of northern Brazil, are out-reproducing the other parts. And it seems to me that very few people are thinking from this perspective of who are the gene pool evolutionary sources and the gene pool evolutionary sinks, right? So San Francisco is a sink. People don't really have kids here. And given they don't have kids here, we should expect the gene pool to be coming from somewhere. It used to be from the Bible Belt. Now it's from Nigeria, Indonesia, some other Southeast Asia places and so on. And then there's the question of okay, if this is the game we're playing, extrapolate this game for a few generations, given what we know about the heritability of psychological characteristics, the heritability of a bunch of other things, where do you expect this to go? Will society become more authoritarian, less authoritarian, more interesting, more valuable, etc.? And I think that exercise is really valuable.
Yes.
And this framework of thinking about sources and sinks.
That's why the show is called simulation. You have to simulate out what is and
right.
That's a very interesting way to think about it too. With the populations as a sink in San Francisco, there's more dogs here than babies,
right.
and versus in a lot of the sub-Saharan Africa, we see birth rates in 5, 6 still, and what developed countries, Japan and the United States, and a lot of like one per replacement fertility. You have one child per couple instead of even two. So that's why you see some populations declining.
So that's where the Christianity story becomes more interesting, at least to me. Like, I was raised non-religious, right? I've had a non-religious upbringing, but Christianity started being more interesting and fascinating to me because as I've studied this more and more, I've grown to think that one of the main drivers that causes women to have to be willing to have more children is to have a culture and a system that is organized around some type of system of religious values. And then, Christianity and Islam are the biggest ones, so they're the easiest ones to talk about, but I guess Judaism also does the same thing, and there's other smaller religious systems that have that create that propensity. Whereas, in most of the places that are, mimetic sources in genetic sinks, right? So San Francisco is a mimetic source and a genetic sink.
Interesting.
And inversely, the Bible Belt is the kind of the inverse, right? It's like if you throw ideas there, the ideas basically like they melt. And but if you throw genes in the Bible Belt, people will have a lot of kids with the genes. Same thing with like Nigeria, right? If you throw interesting ideas about, I don't know, complicated cryptocurrency stuff into the Nigerian population, a lot of it will just melt down. But if you throw your genes in there, there's going to be a lot of small Allens a few generations from now. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Sources and sinks.
And it's interesting to notice that they're inverted, right? The mean people and the gene people are kind of inverted.
They are.
In that regard.
They are. Yeah. You're also fascinated with primatology.
I love bonobos. This is Kanzi. He's the smartest primate that we know of, other than humans. He's famous for absorbing a lot of linguistic abilities. He can create a fire and do a lot of interesting tasks.
Create a fire?
Huh?
Create a fire?
Yeah, he can create a fire. Like
That's very cool.
He can do really like skillful stuff. Oh, this is contact improvisation?
Correct, which you referenced earlier was one of the reasons you came to hippie Berkeley was because you
Yes, I love dancing. I love throwing, like rolling around with random people.
It is they're like cuddle puddles, right? It's very fun stuff, like to be all, loose and dancing and then kind of like rolling around with people. It's a very important thing to do. It really brings you back to, humanity. And less so to these devices and the IT world. And
there's a lot of me that when I go to academic conferences and stuff, I hang out with people who are, they think that their body is the entire function of their bodies is to take their mind to the next conference. And I'm like, okay, maybe we should actually just be a little more monist here. The body and the mind are one. You have to,
So teach us, so what's happening? There's 2 billion Christians, you're seeing this sink and source. And is that the main aspect of the superorganism that you're referencing?
Well, yeah, so then we could also sector Christianity by different parts. And then one interesting thing that I've noticed and that made me write about it was that the Mormons are actually the only Western group, it seems, that is still expanding at a faster rate than the Muslims who immigrated to Europe. So for people who want the West to continue being oriented by the set of values that made possible things like truth, science, seeking of knowledge, and so on, one interesting perspective would be to provide in some way more resources and more ability for Mormonism to keep doing what it has been doing well so far, right? So Mormon moms have, I think on average, 3.4 kids. Mm-hmm. Muslims in Europe have 2.6, and then other denominations in the US, it varies a fair amount, both by religion and by racial group. And I think the Mormons might be kind of, in a sense, a secret to creating this desirable future if there are no transformative technologies, because they are the highest intelligence group and the highest level of trust group that is reproducing at a very fast rate in the world right now, alongside the Ashkenazi Jews, who don't reproduce as fast, but they're pretty smart and they have more training in a world that is already globalized, right? The Ashkenazi Jews have been globalized for a really long time. And the Mormons are very expensive because they send missionaries everywhere. And I think that to the extent that some aspects of what we value in civilization, some aspects of, like, the possibility of creating artificial intelligence, the possibility of creating Burning Man, the possibility of tolerating atheists, the possibility of tolerating a crazy counterculture of hippies dancing. I think all of those things, they're much more acceptable within a Christian framework. They're much more acceptable within a Mormon framework than they are within an Islamic framework, or they are within, like, many other religions as well. And therefore, if we're going to just steer evolution a little bit, maybe we should just bump the Mormons a little bit. That was my intuition and what I wrote about.
Interesting. So this has to do with the ability to tolerate new ideas, and it has ability. The replacement fertility 3.6. You said something very high. 4.4. Yeah. High trust, high truth seeking.
They're I don't know if Mormons are particularly truth seeking, but there's the question of, like, who tolerates best the people who are good at truth seeking, right?
Who tolerates truth seekers best?
That's because a lot of truth seekers, for instance, are atheists or agnostics, and atheists or agnostics are genetic dead ends, right? Like, in 3 generations, most atheists won't leave descendants, because even if you do, like, your children won't, and then your children's children won't. So what you want is for there to be a constant flux of new people on a particular population, say Mormons or Christians or something like that, and then a lot of people will deconvert, and they will become the atheists, the scientists, the agnostics.
Interesting. So
same thing with the Jewish groups, right? There's the Jewish groups that are more orthodox and less orthodox. But in order to keep the amount of liberal Jews that exist, you need the conservative Jews, and then some conservative Jews become liberal Jews.
Yeah. Okay. So
right?
So even though you have like 3.5 children per couple that are Mormon or Jewish or that practice Islam or whatever, that one of them at least occasionally will leave that religion or that school of thinking and go.
Right.
Versus if you only have half a child per couple, then you have almost no chance for your descendants to pick up some of the values of truth seeking and whatnot.
And then the reason why I put the word superorganism there, and that I think that there is value in thinking of it that way, is if you have a superorganism of ants, right? You have the queen ant, and you have soldier ants, and they have specialization, and you have worker ants.
This is entomology, which you are also
This is within entomology. Yeah, this is just in order to make the parallel, like, more valuable. So religious groups also have these separations where you have, like, a priest class, you have a class of the faithful, you have a class that is more fanatic. The more fanatics usually have more children, and so on. So within a religion, you have these specializations. But think of a Christian country like the U.S., right? It's not true that everyone is Christian. But I think that the people in the coast, you can think of them as mimetic soldiers in a sense, right? So they're the people who are not the reproductive lineage. The Bible Belt is the queen. They're producing the new gene pool of, like, new humans.
And then some of them branch out to the coast where they learn more about the mimetics and participate in the...
Right, and some of them even come to California and then tell the entire rest of society that actually, they're all millionaires and they should adopt a bunch of ideas that make them have fewer children, and then they have fewer children. Which is very interesting. Like, I think California, in a sense, is kind of a soldier that is decreasing the population of the other superorganisms in the world, which is
you're viewing this all through a biological lens. It's so interesting. So the queen bee, the reproducer in in an entomological view, this is so interesting. Where are the workers? Where are the reproducers? Where are the mimetics, the driver sources of mimetics?
You have to think of which frequency do you want of which group, and what are the groups that are most likely in the future to generate the frequencies you want. So let's say something that is dear to me, right? I'm seeing, like, there's a picture of Burning Man behind you, right? And Burning Man is a very dear thing to me. I want Burning Man to go on for as long as possible. But I know that the kind of person who goes to Burning Man is not likely to have children, and that Burning Man is definitely like a sink for, like, some of those weirdos in different societies. So I want to make sure that there are more Mormons, because some of those Mormons will deconvert to a less fanatical version of Christianity. Some of those Christians will deconvert to a more liberal, crazy, chaotic thing, and these are the people who will keep Burning Man going. Whereas if I was in a society where there's more strict authoritarian values, saying, like, Erdogan's Turkey, it would be more troublesome, because there can be a crackdown from that kind of society, which prevents people from even being atheist in their ID, being Christian in their ID, that kind of thing. And it could also prevent the sorts of fun hippies that I like to hang out with from existing in the future, which I would be sad about.
So the ability to tolerate ideas, and this is so important. And this, in many ways, as you look at it through an entomological lens, I'm also looking at it through a codified lens of which code do you want to continue propagating, what new code deployments do you want to push out into civilization, and where are the sources of these code deployments and the sources of the genetics of the babies that are being born. This is some very, very cool.
Right.
Okay, now what about the mythological ties? I think you were talking about it a little bit earlier, and how that relates to morality, how that relates to the individual, right? We see a lot of this heroes or heroines' journey stories that are occurring.
Right. So it seems to me that society is waking up now to the psychological value of a lot of what before we just had like automatized in our psychological systems. And I guess the main person by a very large distance who's doing this job is Jordan Peterson, with his like biblical lectures and with his teachings that are being very enticing, let's say, to young men to rethink about the narrative of how they're going to live. So I think this is a very valuable effort. And what I was talking about is what I expect to be like the next stage of that, is that people will realize that there's value not only psychological, but also evolutionary in terms of like these population dynamics, attack and defense and other things that if you're thinking of a beehive, there's that perspective. But going back into the psychological framework for thinking of these things, I think we've had a crisis of meaning, which I guess Nietzsche was one of the main people who indicated it by saying that God is dead, but his shadow will live for 1,000 years, where we didn't really know what to do as a society after the death of God, and this created a propensity for a rise into going back into a less mythological, less religious narrative, and a more biological, racial, kin narrative, which is what moved a lot of the movements that were troublesome in the 20th century and ended up killing a bunch of people. This rise of collectivism seems to be one of the possible events that happens when there's a fall in systems of meaning and religiosity that organize people around. So to me, what happened was, the Christian superorganism in the West, let's say, it lost a lot of its power, and in virtue of it losing a lot of its power, it created the conditions whereby people reverted to a more traditional tribal mode of operation, and that mode of operation led to things like Nazism and other forms of collectivism, such as some extensions of Marxism, right, where you still have the collectivism, although it's not in lines of race. It's a collectivism in lines of like nation. The Soviet Union should be one thing, and so I think that there's this trade-off between meaning and mythos, and how meaning and mythos are able to function as a guide for one specific primate to organize psychologically how they're going to decide through life to go through things, and then if that kind of diminishes, on the other side of the trade-off, you have a rise of collectivism, which is, well, there's someone who's telling me, this is the group of which you're part of that you should care most about. So, care about yourself in virtue of being a Brazilian, in virtue of being an Armenian. And then, sometimes the Armenian genocide happens, which isn't really great. So that kind of thing has been very problematic throughout the 20th century in many parts of the world.
Then what is part of what you're describing here is how do we take what you're describing and synthesize it to what could be like the best code from the mythos and the meaning, as well as the collective potential thinking that we have as well? How can those two?
Right. So I mean, for one thing, it seems that if the arguments that Peterson has been putting forth are right, and a few other evolutionary anthropologists and thinkers are right, it seems that the reason why the biblical stories, for instance, evolved is because they're a very adaptive system,
yeah, go ahead.
a very effective system to make individuals reason their way through life in a way that eventually creates a stable and unified and functional society, right? So you can think of heaven as a metaphor in that if you behave in a biblical way, and if you figure out how to like slay your dragon and get the treasury, and you come back to your tribe and you share the treasury, which is a lot of what the biblical stories reveal, let's say, and if you live in a walled garden, that kind of thing, if that's the psychology that is guiding your actions, you end up creating a society that has positive transformations.
Yes. Yeah. So, and this starts with the simple, you're waking up in the morning, you're doing gratitude, you're, making your bed, you're stretching your body.
Right. Even prayer. I mean, prayer can be thought
yes.
of as a visualization of a destiny that you want, which is a
yes.
very
yes.
fascinating way of getting to there.
Getting to there. Correct. So this is this potential, what do we take as the central ethos and stories that can help individuals with the practices every day that automatically will make a better world. Okay, and then this, I mean, what we were just talking about also has to do with this crisis of meaning that is currently occurring, and one of the things that has come in to help with the crisis of meaning is potentially these lectures and these intellectuals that have come in and said, we think that if you start with your own self and start with practicing these habits in yourself, that you can help your family, help your community, help the world. And so there is also kind of a weird things happening with the fertility rates that are decreasing in places like Japan. You actually said it was due to Japanification.
Right, I call it Japanification. And I think it's a process that's also happening in the West, right? Where, we're reducing populations pretty much everywhere, and I think that has a lot to do with the Californian memes being spread all over the world into societies where they're not necessarily adaptive anymore. Thinking that everyone can be like a liberal individual, libertarian millionaire who organizes their lives around like cybernetic stuff and information theory and thinks in those ways. Yeah, you tell that to people in different societies, they're going to stop living in the ways that made their genes like go on, and that made their population stable, and that created a stable society for them. So, I think there's some trouble in there. Japanification might be the version there where it's only one country, it's less influenced by that kind of culture, but it's a separation of the sexes just because the two sexes have different incentives. Whereas what I think is happening in the West is like it's that, but on top of that, there's also an incentivized promotion of like people no longer forming families and no longer creating the conditions for a stable population over time.
And I'm sure we're going to talk to Katie about this on the next show, but the code here seems to be in some ways like when we were talking about Junine at the beginning, this interdependent capitalism seems to take potentially some more of this original source code of these biological kin, this mother, this love, unconditional love, and taking it. That's why you see when you're walking with sometimes a stranger, you're trying to have an altruistic interaction, but it doesn't happen.
Right.
And so the code hasn't scaled to that degree, and I think maybe some of the code that's caused, and we were talking about this earlier about the families not being potentially as important. Mimetic sources potentially make it, you aim to climb up this hierarchy of mimetic source. There's no time for genetics. There's no time for procreation. And then women are trying to climb up that same hierarchy too of mimetics.
And the corporations want people to not have time for biology and to not have time to keep the gene pool being one of like high trust, high intelligence, high value people who are organized or who organized. I mean, the corporations want that, the state wants that. The entire system is designed around reducing the propensity of the people who could create the most positive society from dedicating themselves to genes, and then incentivizing them to dedicating themselves either to dopamine hits or to memes. Those are the two things for which society is being The high levels of society are being twisted right now.
So let's see if I can do a little quick paraphrase as well. So on the mimetic sources, there's at the same time there's the desire to want to spread memes to billions of people, which is very interesting. It can augment civilization in interesting ways, but then if you're not a mimetic sourcer, sometimes you can fall into the constant urge for dopamine from video games, from drugs, and then that also takes people away from finding meaning, creating value into the world, genetic procreation. So that takes away from procreation.
Speak for yourself. There's a big meaning on the drugs work for me.
Video games work for me.
The question is, how many children did they produce?
I love my family.
And then let's take into the on that genetics, on the high procreation side of things. Why would you say then is the incentive structure that we have today? What's happening with the government and the private entities, the corporations that want don't want? Why is there a strong desire for, they want more productive workers? They don't want them focused as much on family, and when there's less babies, it's a kind of weird thing, because when you want a kid, you also get another mind to kind of mold into the world. So wouldn't they also potentially want? But a human labor can be less effective than a robotic labor.
Yeah, in a world where there was sufficient homogeneity of pretty much everything, right? If every land piece was homogeneous, if every nation was homogeneous, if there was zero inequality in the world, then they would be in favor of families. But what happens is that we live in a world where you can get the benefits that were generated by the biomes of different countries, by the superorganisms of different religions and different systems, without necessarily having to pay the costs. So why would I want to pay your salary to be good enough for you to sustain your wife and 2 children if I can instead hire, whoever turns out in the entire population of India to be one of the best 10 computer scientists, right? So I, as a corporation, have an interest in keeping some level of open borders so that I can bring in whatever turns out to be the best of that selection pool, whilst at the same time kind of keeping your part at bay. And then I get the best people from literally every country in the world, and I make them stop having kids, which is what the USA kind of does. I mean, the USA is great in many ways. This is one of the things that it does that is a little bit more problematic. Because 10 generations from now, the Flynn effect is also doing this thing where, IQ went up for quite a while, mostly due to nutrition. But now it's definitely going to go down because, the people who are producing the most by very far in the world, average IQ is 70, 80, 85. And individually, right? It's not just a matter of average. Within countries, between countries, everywhere, right? It's Idiocracy, like that movie I've never seen, but everyone tells me about.
So one of the major problems you just pointed at is that a lot of the highest IQ or the highest most abstract thinkers about civilization, the ones that are actually moving the next ways that better our world into code and into action, these people aren't having kids.
Right. That is one problem. It's not just the fact that there's this divergence between different parts in the world in terms of salary, right? It's worthwhile for someone to come from India to here. But also there's the woman question that you mentioned, which is do I want my workforce to lose a bunch of people who are going to be stay-at-home moms and taking care of their babies, or do I want to get women to be as productive as possible and have to pay half a salary instead?
And then they can continue being productive. Meanwhile, you continue sourcing the best talent from around the world, from those local maximums across the world, because you have the most money, you're the largest superorganism. This very much so seems like Google trying to maybe monopolize the substrate that everybody uses and just continues to.
Right. It's a monopoly on who gets to suction the best genes without that much of a care for the future from both the big corporations and some of the big states that are magnets, state magnets that are states that are so awesome that everyone wants to move to them.
A monopoly
like your
suction.
family did, I did,
Yeah. A monopoly suction of the best genes.
Yeah.
And this is a very serious.
Like we've outsourced reproduction to different parts of the world, in doing this outsourcing, what happens is that the externalities of that are not being taken into account, and they are deferred to future generations who are not going to have as many valuable creators and high conscientious people and so on as our generation had. Tough.
Yeah. Okay, couple quick things on the way out. I know you have an argument against effective altruism, which I think, or it's a corruption. It's a corruption. Yeah. Effective altruism is a very interesting
is great.
Thing. It is. It's a very interesting
problems,
thing.
Yes.
And I think an interesting argument for it that I think still stands, though, right, is that you can either spend your time going immediately to a place in the world that desperately needs attention and going and using your human labor hours there, or you can do things like earn the financial means in a developed part of the world to do 5 times as much impact in that area of the world. So this is the idea of how effective is the altruism that is being delivered. How do we quantify that and measure that? And so it's now grown to become a superorganism in some ways, a small organism, let's say, that has more corruption.
Yeah, I think what happened with EA is there's been 2 processes that made effective altruism worse than what it was before, right? So when we conceived of it, when we created of it, it was very exciting. There were a lot of very good people who were trying to, as quickly as possible, deliver as many goods as possible in terms of trying to theorize and architect a movement that was going to make the world a better place by the most effective means possible, right? That was great. And then the 2 problems that I see with it is once there's an influx of resources, be that in the state, be that in a corporation, or be that in an NGO or in a set of NGOs, like it's the case in effective altruism, you have the interest of whoever is like bringing in that money, and you also have people who are trying to ring fence the money in order to foster their own causes and kind of corrupt the system in that way. So what happened in EA was a lot of the best people who were the original creators of the movement kind of separated themselves from EA and started dedicating themselves to far future stuff, crucial considerations, to artificial general intelligence, and separated themselves, at least from a brand perspective, from EA. Which already left the movement kind of hanging down a little bit. And then there's the secondary process where if you're pumping money into an entity, whatever it is, the state, the corps, and so on, people who don't have sufficiently much competency that they would be creating a lot of value, try to capture that value on its way in and on its way out. And I think in the case of EA, there's been a lot of similarity between what happened to EA and what happened to the Democratic Party of the USA, meaning that the poverty-related causes in EA, the national-related causes in EA ended up becoming kind of a platform of the Democratic Party. So what before was okay, let's find the most impactful, neglected, and tractable causes in the world and invest in them. Now it's well, there's this person who works for one of the EA organizations that's being sponsored by one of the Facebook billionaires, and in doing so, they're distributing resources for incarcerated people in Florida to get the vote. And it's who cares if the incarcerated people in Florida get the vote or don't get the vote, given that there might be 10 to the 32 people into the far future, if life is only biological, 10 to the 51 if it's computational, and when there's so many different ways in which you could intervene with things like schistosomosis control, malaria control, and so on in the present world, right? Even if you are a present chauvinist, right? Even if you pretend the future doesn't exist, which is an absurd philosophical position if you ask me, but even if we pretend that, there were still much better investments to do than that. And I think EA got corrupted on those lines.
Yeah. To be able to continuously measure the efficacy of what we're delivering and what to focus on.
It's very hard because the people who are bringing in the money, they bring us, like sometimes are the same people who are bringing in the corruption, right?
That's
just
crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, let's ask you about you were targeting this in the last part as well. This AI safety and security. This is exploding as you talk about this in as well in your content where you say that if we just think that we just leave this alone, the malevolent characters that are the democratized cost malevolent characters can still take off with it. So AI safety and security is a lot about making sure that the malevolence cannot occur.
Right. Well, I mean, AI safety has been the thing that I dedicated most of my early adulthood to, right? So for about 10 years, I was dedicating to effective altruism, to movements, and etc. But within those, an emphasis on the far future. Within the far future, an emphasis on crucial considerations, and within crucial considerations, an emphasis on AI, just because I think that from an impact perspective, AI is it's the one that if we solve that problem, it's going to reduce dramatically the magnitude of a lot of the other problems that could happen. So out of all the existential risks that could come to pass, AI is the one that deletes most of the other ones, and therefore one of the most valuable ones. And it's also one that seems more actionable. It's not very easily actionable to work on, like brain scanning. Like either it will become a neuromorphic problematic thing or it won't, but in AI you can actually use technical human knowledge to try and help it out. I don't think that malevolence of humans is the main worry that we should be having on AI. At least if we're talking about superintelligence, artificial general intelligence, because there's sufficiently many technical problems that just getting the technicality right. Maybe governance problems might be more relevant in terms of like how do you make sure that in a multipolar world where many different agents or many different artificial intelligences are operating against each other, how do you prevent evolutionary conflict between them that will create the types of incentives that will make one of the players kind of, cast a very negative spell very early on in the game that could compromise all the value of the future. I do think that we should think about AI from the perspective of governance, but I think about it more in terms of systems and less in terms of like Dr. Evil is planning the AI in his basement or something like that.
Yeah.
Having some centralized control is actually good, right? I have become more conservative and more right-leaning, but this is a case where I go in the other direction and I'm more of a statist, like left-leaning movement because I want there to be more centralized control of who has the ability of creating an AI. And in the current world, only states are big enough, to do that kind of thing.
And why not use some of this data fusion technology, these little credit score technologies where you just don't get access to a gun or artificial intelligence or synthetic biology or whatever the disastrous potential may be if you have had a previous record of significant malevolence. I mean, that's the centralized argument side of things. And,
of course.
And there is a little centralized community that maintains like the Bitcoin core, right? So the Ethereum core, these are little groups that you have to work your way up in terms of cryptography and blockchain technologies in order to partake.
There's some sort of like credibility system that basically pumps the right people to the top. And what we want in terms of morality and like reorganizing the people who are already like they've given up on genetics and they're only living in the meme space. For those people, I think what we want is to align the incentives of fame and capitalism and power as much as possible with morality and with creating a good future. So that would be a great way to.
Yeah, your fifth boat or fifth gold watch is just it's not going to add any value to your life anymore. It's the interdependent capitalism is
that's a case where we actually want to like remove the evolutionary incentive, right? We have this evolutionary desire from signaling to everyone,
exactly,
and
make it not
we've
cool.
Signaled enough, we can signal a little less.
The Instagram feeds have gone ridiculous, promoting that type of behavior and making that the incentive in
and
culture.
Depressing teenage girls and a bunch of other things.
The young people and Jay, this has been super fun. I want to ask you 2 questions on the way out, okay?
All right.
This is simulation, so we have to ask you, are we in a simulation?
I I take the same response as Bostrom. I don't talk about my probability of us being in a simulation in public because I think it can be misinterpreted by people in many different ways. But yeah, there is a probability, and I think I assign a higher probability than most people would.
Okay. Yeah, I do too. Good.
We're
on
probably
the
living in
same
the
page. Okay.
in some ways.
I was going to say, this is probably the safest place for you to not be misinterpreted with this question.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I buy the simulation argument, right? So the simulation hypothesis is the hypothesis that we are, but the simulation argument is one of those three things is true. You probably are familiar with that. Either we won't create simulated civilizations, or we will restrict their number enormously, or we will, we will create them, and then most people already are in one, or we'll destroy ourselves before we're able to do it to begin with. So I do assign some probability mass to being in a simulation. Yeah. For one thing, it would increase my chances of immortality, which sounds great.
Interesting. Yes,
if I'm just the ape that most people think I am, odds are that
you're less likely to be immortal.
That there's a limit at the edge. That I'm less likely to be long-lived.
Long-lived,
the first million years is what counts. So.
Yeah. And there's a whole slew of other areas to go with the whole infinite beings and where we go pre-birth and post-death and that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun in that, the metaphysics of that.
Yeah. Okay, and then last question is, what is the most beautiful thing in the world?
The most beautiful thing in the world? I think I would go for something enveloped within another thing, enveloped within another thing. So maybe something like after a delicious conversation with friends, reading a Nick Bostrom paper over a pyramid at Burning Man before before the sunset. That sounds like a good combination of things. So that would be a beautiful experience. Yeah. I like the idea of enveloping beauty in different kinds of beauty. So. Yeah,
you took a very meta perspective on that.
Analysis
you tapped in so many different things into the chain of beauty there. Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, I think complexity is one of the valuable things around in the universe that generates a lot of beauty. I love complexity.
Yeah.
You
must be a great romantic. With that whole.
I'm an incorrigible romantic, as you might find out in the next interview.
Jacob, thank you so much for coming on to the show. We greatly appreciate it. Yeah, there was a lot of very, very good wisdom unpacked there.
Helen, Ron, thank you very much, guys.
Yes. Thank you everyone for tuning in. We greatly appreciate you. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what you're thinking. Go and have more conversations with other people about what was talked about here. Huge shout out to you, Ron Vargas. Thank you for producing and directing. We love you very much. Also, everyone, support the artists and entrepreneurs that you believe in. Diego's links are below, Simulation's links are below. Support them. Let them flourish. Help them flourish. And go and build the future. Manifest your dreams into the world. We love you so much, and we will see you soon. Peace.